All right, up next, we're going to hear from Dr. Tara Paris, an associate professor at UCLA and a Friends of the Semel Institute scholar. Contributions to WOW supports scholars like Dr. Paris. This is why we're here. Tara's research interests are optimizing treatment outcomes for severe anxiety, OCD, and related conditions. She also focuses on evidence-based treatments for child and adolescent anxiety and related disorders. So to tell you more about her work, please welcome Dr. Tara Paris.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction and for the opportunity to be here today. What an amazing event. I feel so privileged to be here with you all. I've just been blown away by all the speakers so far. Events like these are so important for raising awareness about the impact of mental illness and about what we as a community can do about it. And for me, that awareness, or an important piece of that awareness, begins with recognizing that many forms of mental illness begin in childhood or adolescence. We know that 1 in 5 kids has a diagnosed psychiatric condition. And in my area of research, anxiety disorders, we know that as many as 1 in 3 kids will have an anxiety disorder by the time they reach 18. These numbers are staggering. And I think it can be easy to overlook what they mean in real-world terms. I don't know, with anxiety at least, I often think maybe because we all get anxious, everybody in this room has had the experience of worry, we can lose sight of just how devastating it can be at the extremes, how absolutely, it just will bring life to an utter stop. I recently treated a little girl who was so anxious that she'd stopped going to school. There was no bully. When I inquired about her relationship with the teacher, there didn't seem to be anything amiss there. But she was so scared she'd stopped going. She'd also stopped going to play dates because she was too nervous to leave her mom and dad. She also was afraid to go to sleepovers. That was just impossible in her mind. And I think as adults, we can all recognize the academic costs, right? She was quickly falling behind on her schoolwork. She was on the brink of having to repeat a grade. That stuff was obvious. But the social cost, the cost of missed friendships, not hanging out with her friends, exploring new interests, just engaging freely in life, it was profound. When her parents came to see me, the solution was pretty straightforward. Not necessarily easy, but straightforward. We began a course of cognitive behavioral therapy, the treatment that's been shown to work best for anxiety disorders, and gradually we had her learn to practice coping skills for confronting her anxiety. And every week we'd practice strategies for being courageous and brave. That little girl is now back at school. She's getting dropped off at playdates and at extracurriculars, and she recently started having sleepovers with her grandparents. We'll continue the work, and I don't doubt at all that she will finish the rest that needs to be done. But I think about this little girl and others like her frequently in my work. In my research, I've tried to understand what drives anxiety at a biological level so that we can develop treatments that might target it more directly. This is really important for developing treatments that work more quickly, that are longer lasting, more efficient. And about 5 years ago, I was really fortunate to receive a grant from the Friends of the Semel Institute to support this work. It was a large investment of their resources, but the project that I was proposing involved neuroimaging, and that kind of work is extraordinarily expensive. There's no way I could have funded the project on my own. With their support, though, I was able to collect pilot data that I was able to use to submit a grant. And within a few years, I had a grant from the federal government for nearly $4 million. And a project, thank you. It's a project that reaches across the city and involves really schools citywide in every pocket of Los Angeles. And the reach just is more than I ever could have imagined. I am one of many researchers that the Friends of the Semel Institute has supported over the years, and I feel so privileged to speak on behalf of all of them when I say that we owe a huge debt of gratitude to them and to you for all that you do to support our work. So thank you.
Please welcome Dr. Kelsey Martin, Dean of the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA and award-winning journalist, best-selling author, NBC News special anchor, former First Lady of California, and founder of the Women's Alzheimer Movement, Maria Shriver.
Well, it's really, really wonderful to be here today with Maria Shriver, and I can't tell you how happy it makes me to look out at all of these beautiful, wonderful, high-energy women and a few men scattered in between. It makes me happy as a neuroscientist. It makes me happy as the Dean of the School of Medicine, because I have such a strong belief that the energy and the brilliance and the creativity of women is going to be so important for solving so many of the problems that we experience as human beings and that we're trying to address at UCLA Health. We're going to talk about Alzheimer's disease today, and on that note, I do want to do a shout out to one of the really visionary women who's in the audience, Phyllis Easton, who together with her husband, Jim Easton, have provided really philanthropic generosity and vision for enabling research in Alzheimer's disease. So thank you. And I'm especially thrilled that I get to share with you all today. You're the first to hear about this, a new initiative in which the David Geffen School of Medicine and the Women's Alzheimer's Movements have partnered. We're partnering now to establish a Women's Alzheimer's Movement Research Initiative. And this initiative is going to fund a faculty member in UCLA's Semel Institute or the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital to conduct specifically sex and gender-based Alzheimer's disease research. That's transformative. That's really groundbreaking, because by being able to use the scientific method, our scholarship to understand the basis of Alzheimer's disease in women is really the path to being able to develop targeted prevention strategies, targeted therapies for Alzheimer's disease in women. So I couldn't be happier. I feel like we're about to open onto a new adventure and initiative and partnership together that's going to change the way that women receive care for Alzheimer's disease. So Maria, you're so passionate about this issue and this movement, and can you tell us about your journey and what got you involved in the Women's Alzheimer's Movement?
Well, thank you, Dr. Martin, and I just want to say how happy I am to be here with so many people who are trying to move the needle, who are moving the needle in women's health, and that's all of you. And I really believe that we need to move the needle tremendously when it comes to women's health, because when it comes to medicine, sex matters. And we need to push our doctors, our researchers, our hospitals, not only to hear us, not only to believe us, to see us, but to push medicine to understand that our bodies are in fact different. That what we heard earlier about menses to motherhood to menopause, I would add, and beyond, we age differently, we experience things differently, and medicine and doctors have not kept up with us. They have not recognized us as individuals. They have not recognized that sex in medicine matters. So I'm really pleased to be here at this. I'm really excited about this initiative, which looks at gender and looks at how women's brains change as we age. And I think it might help us understand why 2/3 of those living with Alzheimer's are women. And that is a fact that very few people, even today, and I've been traveling all over sounding this alarm for years, understand. 2/3 of those caring for people with Alzheimer's in our country are also women. And they're doing that on top of working, raising children, and they're caring for patients or parents, and that's a 24-hour cycle, and that impacts us cognitively, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, and physically. So I think that's why this is so important, is to look at what happens to women's brains starting in that menses period, starting what happens to women's brains, not just their bodies, when you get pregnant. What happens to your brain when you're perimenopausal, when you're menopausal and postmenopausal? And the big thing is, a lot happens to your brain. So I think having a researcher prompting doctors to look at sex difference is really important. And the women's Alzheimer's movement exists to try to understand why 2/3 of those living with Alzheimer's are women. Why are more and more women in their 50s and 60s stepping forward and saying, there's something wrong with my memory, there's something wrong with my brain, and every doctor just tells them to go home and relax. So, this is I think every single woman in this room can be an advocate, not just for her own health and her own brain health, but to push back to doctors when they tell them that, to push back when your symptoms aren't taken seriously, to push back when you are not believed, and to demand that your doctors, when they give you medicine, ask if it's been researched on a woman. When they talk to you, ask them if they know about sex difference. When they push back to you regarding menopause, be informed about how your brain is changing and not just your body is changing. So I'm super happy to be talking to you and to be starting this initiative here. But this is something that the entire nation is lagging behind on, and I've traveled all over. There's no preeminent center for women's health. There are no places where you go in and they talk to you about the connection between depression and Alzheimer's, between the connection between diabetes and Alzheimer's, the connection between hypertension and Alzheimer's, and how different minority groups have a different relationship with Alzheimer's. So that's why I'm excited about this. And my own road to this started when my dad became diagnosed with Alzheimer's back in 2003. And I thought, wow, if a brain like that, that's so intense, that's so intellectual, that's so smart, could disintegrate in real time in front of me, if that could happen to him, it could happen to anybody. And so I began this quest as a journalist to try to understand what it was, where it started, who did it impact, and it kind of coincided to my time as First Lady of California, and I ran a big women's conference, and more women were coming up to me and saying, I'm a caregiver, my mom has Alzheimer's, and so I started going to researchers and saying, I think more and more women have it, and they said, no, you're wrong. And I said, I don't think so, because I'm programming breakout sessions on caregiving, and they're standing room only. And yet everywhere I went, to every hospital, they told me no. So I partnered with the Alzheimer's Association and spent 2 years reporting on it. And lo and behold, we discovered that the vast majority of people living with it were women. 20 years in your brain, so it's starting in your 40s, your 30s, your 50s, and beyond. And so we published a report to the nation under the banner of the Shriver report, and still I found that there was no funding for women-based research, so we started the Women's Alzheimer's movement to agitate, irritate, instigate, and everything in between, hospitals, doctors, and also to educate women to be messengers of this message. Alzheimer's is not a disease of your 70s and 80s. It's a disease to be aware of in your 30s and 40s. So for your own brain health, and to be on deck for your mothers, your fathers, your girlfriends, and beyond. That's a long answer to your question.
No, that's a great answer. It's a great answer. And I have to add that I was listening, actually behind there, to Dr. Wendy Suzuki, who I knew back when she was the electrophysiologist working on the hippocampus. And it used to be that all research on the brain was done not just in male humans, but actually in male animals. And we learned a lot about the hippocampus in male mice and male, non-human primates. And then one of my colleagues made this stunning discovery that the number of connections between brain cells in the brain change during the menstrual cycle, changed dramatically during the menstrual cycle, and it kind of broke open for a hardcore neuroscientist this idea of how different the brain is in a woman and how different the brain is in a man at different stages of their life. And I just think it's such a great example. It's this great convergence of a recognition at a scientific level of these sex differences, together with a real movement of recognizing as women, as patients, that there's a need to understand the specific needs and the specific causes of disease in women. So I want to thank you for your initiative in that. And so caretaking is really a labor of love, and your organization raises awareness about the emotional, the physical, and the financial cost to everyone who's involved. So how does caretaking specifically affect women?
Well, as I mentioned, 2/3 of the caregivers, not just in the Alzheimer's and dementia space in this country, are women, and that's about 17 million unpaid caregivers. But we have about 40 to 50, and that's kind of a million people in unpaid caregiving, not to mention those who are doing this for a living. So it is obviously for anybody who's done it, and I bet the vast majority of people in this room have experienced it, whether it's for a parent with Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, ALS, a special needs child. It's really challenging to work and also to do that, right? And it's expensive to hire somebody to do it. And also corporate America has not kept up with, we're struggling to get maternal policies, much less caregiving policies. So I always look at this issue as it's personal, it's public, and it's really political. And so, caregiving has emotional toll on the caregiver themselves. They often put their physical, mental, cognitive health on the back burner. So many women end up using family savings to care for a loved one who might have Alzheimer's and dementia, then end up, when the time comes for themselves, broke and alone. And the vast majority of women in this country will die alone. And I won't even get into the broke part here. But, I think that everywhere I go, I try to advocate for women to see this issue, Alzheimer's, caregiving, and really aging, as the political issue of our time, to vote for people who want to fund NIH funding into Alzheimer's and other diseases, who want to put caregiving policies in our country at the level that our defense is funded, because every family in this country is going bankrupt under the weight of Alzheimer's. The entire medical health system in our country is going bankrupt simply on Alzheimer's alone. And that's why I'm really glad to be leading a big task force here in California. Governor Newsom appointed me to lead a task force to report to him about how California, which has the most cases of Alzheimer's in the nation, the most caregivers of any state in the nation, how can we be better prepared? How can we prevent it? And I'm adding kind of an additional component. How can we chart the path forward for an aging state? California, contrary to our image, is an aging state. We are an aging country. The numbers of people who will get Alzheimer's or another form of dementia are staggering. Not in the future, today. So caregiving, aging, dementia, Alzheimer's, it's all connected. And it is a women's burden, and it's a women's issue. And I believe, having worked many, many years in women's empowerment, this is, to me, the defining women's empowerment issue, because you cannot work if you don't have a mind. You cannot work at your potential if you're caring for a child and a parent simultaneously. And if you drop out of your prime earning years, you will lose your financial future and you will end up broke. So that's the good news.
Yeah, I was going to say.
But I actually look at that as the good news, because the facts are right there. And I think it's really empowering. I don't find that daunting. I don't find it hopeless. I find it inspiring. I find it informative. And it gets me moving every single day to be irritating, instigating, agitating, and pushing.
Got it. So I'm really surprised. California, there are more cases of Alzheimer's in
Yes.
California.
Well, because we're also so big.
Because we're
Yeah.
so big. So
And it's also, dominant in the Latino community, the African American
that's right,
community. And so it's a huge issue. And we are, as I said, which people don't realize, a graying state. We like to think we're young, we're hip, we're cool. We're getting older. And we have a lower birth rate. We have a huge gap in the amount of people who want to go into caregiving as a profession because it doesn't pay well. It's not a valued system. So that brings in also the kind of the value of women's work, the value of what we value. I think it's a kind of overall care agenda, which I'm super excited about. And as I believe, I think it's going to require every single woman in this room to be armed with the facts, and she can also be a revolutionary in that respect.
So does that, sort of knowledge and education, how does that change the way that caregivers can be effective?
Well, I don't think it can, it doesn't necessarily, well, first of all, if you hire a caregiver, making sure that that caregiver has the knowledge about what Alzheimer's is and isn't, how it might be different from Parkinson's or ALS or some other disease that their person is caring for. I found that, like with my dad, he needed different kinds of caregivers at different intervals in the disease. Alzheimer's, a doctor told me in my research, once you've seen one case of Alzheimer's, you've seen one case of Alzheimer's.
Right, exactly.
Because it manifests so differently in women and men. Some people have a very quick experience with it. Some it's drawn out for 20 years. So you might need, initially, we hired a male caregiver to drive my dad because he wanted to continue to drive. He wanted to continue to go to the office. So we took his keys away, and we hired somebody that looked like a male assistant that could take him to the office. Over time, that changed, and he needed a different kind of caregiver. It's really expensive. We were able to do that. Most people, can't in our country. And also assisted living is really expensive. And we just did a really big poll, the Women's Alzheimer's Movement, which said that, most boomers want their children to care for them. They expect a family member will care for them, but they've never spoken to the caregiver, the potential caregiver, which is their kids, and they've never put any money aside to help them care for them because they think it's covered by the government. Well, it's not. So that's why, I could sit here and we could go through the financial aspects of this, the political aspects of this, but the exciting thing is that I think is to be armed with the information and the ability to make a change and the ability to be an informed voter, an informed patient when you take your parent and when you yourself go and say, like, I'm feeling a little bit like I can't remember, I'm foggy, or people come up to me all the time like, I couldn't remember so-and-so's name. Does that mean I have Alzheimer's? So I think being informed about what it is and isn't, who's eligible to get it. So people say to me, well, it doesn't run in my family, so I can't get it, right? And I'm like, no, wrong. But so I think, the more we educate people about what it is and what it isn't, and educate people at a really early age, that's my mission.
So part of your nonprofit's mission is really to educate the public about the connection between lifestyle and public health. And you wrote a piece in September, this past September for Today, and you called for wellness, diet, exercise, social engagement to be part of the American dream. So can you talk a bit about wellness and prevention and what people can do to reduce their risk of developing Alzheimer's disease?
Well, I think we heard, earlier the conversation about, kind of connection, asking somebody how they really, truly are. For so many people as they age, that falls by the wayside. Nobody's inviting people to, parties. People who are 60, 65, 70 aren't working. Corporate America is not, although kind of interesting, a lot of this guy who runs a huge caregiving company told me that more and more people, 55 and 60, were applying to be caregivers because corporate America isn't using them anymore, and they feel like they have 15 years of really great work in them, and they want to be helpful, and they want to be part of something with meaning. But getting back to kind of, forging a connection between young people and older people, social connection is really important, as we heard, for the brain. Exercise, as Wendy and Julianne just showed you, creates BDNF, really important for the brain. Diet, we have learned that people who are on the Mediterranean diet live longer, but it's not just because they're on the Mediterranean diet. They're moving, they're having social connection, they have a spiritual life, they live in neighborhoods. So there's multiple things. People say to me, well, if I take turmeric, will I be okay? Or if I eat a blueberry, is that it? So I think it's really, trying to talk about a holistic lifestyle, which includes diet, sleep, meditation, resting your brain. I tried to talk to my daughter and my kids all the time about being bored, being free, letting your mind rest. Everybody's mind now is 24 hours a day connected, and so everybody's anxious, stressed out, right? Like, meditating, trying to turn off your phone for a little bit, rests your brain. Sleep clears your brain. I mean, as a neuroscience, and people know that, but actually a lot of people don't know that. And then being aware that as you age, your brain changes. And so what may have worked for you eating wise in your 40s may not work in your 50s, 60s, and beyond.
So as you said, you were recently appointed to lead Governor Newsom's Alzheimer's Prevention and Preparedness Task Force. And many people are not as involved in politics and government. What can other individuals do to really be impactful?
Well, as I said, I think you can vote.
Yeah, that would help. That would always help, right? That would always help, yeah.
I just kind of had an interesting experience with this administration, and so I
State or federal?
Federal.
Federal, okay.
And the Secretary of Education wanted to cut all the funding for Special Olympics that they had contracted with Special Olympics Education, which is in schools. It's not the Special Olympics sports program. It's a division where we educate in schools about special needs children, all kinds of programs in schools, and the entire country erupted. People pushed back, fought back, and, I did some stuff, my brother did some stuff, but really special needs parents, people who had volunteered, community activists, everybody just said, oh, hell no. And lo and behold, I was shocked. Trump came and was like, okay, I'll switch. And I was like, whoa. Like, not only will that guy switch if he really feels the heat, but it just showed me the power that we have collectively. It showed me also that people's voices matter, that they can create change, that we can push back, and that we have impact. So I think we can vote for people, as I say, who believe in science. We can.
Thank you.
We can vote. We can vote for people who have a caregiving agenda. We can vote for people who believe in, maternal policies. We can vote for people who reflect our experiences. I think that's a really important thing. And then on the kind of like granular level, I think we can advocate with our daughters, our sisters, our mothers, and we can push back against our doctors, or we can demand that the hospitals that we support look and have a sex-gender difference in that hospital, or we withhold our money. So I think that there's a lot that individuals can do, that collective groups can do. People could join the Women's Alzheimer's Movement, where we fund research into women's brains all across the country. We're establishing Alzheimer's prevention clinics. And so to really be, and to care about our brains starting at a very early age. And I think that's really so important, and to not think that Alzheimer's is just something that's going to happen to me or is a normal part of aging, because it isn't. And as we look at longevity, the goal is to age well,
Yep.
but to age with our bodies and our minds intact.
Yeah. So along those lines, I am so grateful for the support for research on brain health, because I think that's another really promising way. And I want to echo Lisa Kudrow that there are those donation envelopes at all of your tables. I think we've heard from Tara Paris about this ability to use a scholarship to really understand brain health. And I think that that's a path forward to being able to prevent, cure Alzheimer's disease. And
But so many people tell me that when they go to see their doctor, the doctor never talks to them about their brain health.
yeah.
And the other thing, I'm doing a big series on the Today Show about this. Most women think a women's physical is a pap smear and a mammogram. And like, it's not. That is not a physical. And I talk to women who are in their 50s and 60s, and their primary doctor is their obstetrician. And, I'm like, well, do you talk about your brain health, your heart health? Do you know the connection between diabetes or depression and your brain? Like, no, nobody's ever asked me any of that stuff. I don't know what to ask. So I think that this is a great opening to educate women. Once, as I was saying in the Today Show, like, they're all like, and this is like smart people, journalists, they're like, it's not a physical to have a mammogram and a pap smear? And I'm like, no. Like, no, it's not.
I don't know how many of you remember our bodies ourselves.
Yes.
We need the brain in that part.
Well,
right?
it's funny you say that, because I went to meet with the women of that book, because it is defunct, and it's such an important thing, and they couldn't get funding for it, and it needs obviously to be updated. And there's all this shame around menopause and perimenopause, and women feel they're losing their minds. And then when I say to women, well, it's not just losing your period that is menopause, it's your brain. And they're like, oh. I'm like, yeah. And then the whole conversation around hormones. It's another thing I'm trying to get the Today Show to do a big series on, because, estrogen is a neuroprotector for the brain. Mm-hmm. We know this when it comes to Alzheimer's research, but women, thank you, and, NIH, which left everybody kind of with, and I'm also there at NIH saying you got to redo the Women's Health Initiative,
right?
Because you left everybody on the ground. And I actually said to the head, why haven't you done that? He's like, well, nobody asked. So there's a lot of that, well, nobody asked. And so I think I always look at that as irritating and empowering simultaneously. Mm-hmm. So I think, we could sit here and talk about what we've learned about hormones and its connection to Alzheimer's and what happens to the perimenopausal brain, which is what we're trying to fund and understand. Mm-hmm. And but I would urge women who are perimenopausal, menopausal, postmenopausal, to have that conversation, obviously to be aware of your own health history. But there is a lot of really impressive research around that and your brain.
And I've met so many people just today who've come up to me and said how scared they are of Alzheimer's disease. And so I think it's learning, getting that knowledge that's so critical to being able to not be scared, to be ready for in ourselves and in the people we love and care for.
I think it's now the number one thing that people are terrified of is Alzheimer's. And of course, it is terrifying. And but I've always found in my own life, when something is terrifying, it can either be paralyzing, or if you just dive in and go, let me take that anxiety and that fear and all that's around that and put it to use. So if you're terrified of Alzheimer's, come join me. If you're terrified of aging, come join me. If you have somebody, my kids always say, people come up to me, my mom has Alzheimer's, and I'm like, great, you can. They're like, no, what? Don't say great, mommy. Don't. But I'm like, yes, because you are the people that are going to change it. Mm-hmm. You are. I tell people, they're like, well, I put my mom in an assisted living facility. I said, go in and fight for the right diet in there. Go in and fight for the right caregiving in there. Bring dance into the assisted living place. Bring music into the assisted living place. Bring art. And they're like, well, I don't think I could do that. I'm like, how much are you paying a month? see yourself as the advocate, not just on the political level, but on the personal level. You should make sure that the food that's being given to your parent isn't laden with sugar, isn't making that Alzheimer's worse. Make sure that there are things in there that get your loved one moving. So, people are right to be afraid. I mean, I'm terrified, but I'm also energized, which helps with the fear.
Got it. So on that note,
Thank you very much.
So thank you, Maria.